Hi, everyone. To begin, we'll highlight where we left off. Our last presentation turned the corner from the middle years of social theory to look at contemporary American thoughts. So here we're looking at people that are alive and writing today, and people who are also carry on the traditions that we talked about earlier in the semester, whether it be the traditions of classical theorists or the traditions of the middle year theorist. So, specifically looking at contemporary social theory, we're looking at contemporary American social theory. So, we say these contemporary theorists are building on American social thought of the middle years. So, in D'Amelio, you can see the legacy of Cooley and Mead by a focus on identity and identity emergence. And then you can look at Sasson as carrying on the legacy of Du Bois with a focus on community sociology. This community sociology that ties into the Chicago School tradition of social thought. Other Chicago School theorists directly, indirectly connected to that community sociology focus are Howard Becker, William Julius Wilson, and Elijah Anderson. So, in addition to recognizing the continuation of the middle years American social thought in D'Amelio, in Sasson, we can also see how they incorporate classical theory by focusing on Marxism as well, by looking at how capitalism is a driving force within social reality. Our final reading of the semester will be different selections from Gary Allen Fine's Kitchens, The Culture of Restaurant Work. So, Gary Allen Fine represents a contemporary American social theorist, and he continues the ideas that we've seen before with respect to Cooley and Mead and kind of the formalization of Cooley and Mead's theory and symbolic interactionism, which we saw in the Adler's piece. And then we also see a continuation of that community sociology focus that started with Du Bois, then it's kind of continued from there to be seen in various American social theorists that I just touched on, including Sasson, Howard Becker, William Julius Wilson, and Elijah Anderson. So Gary Allen Fine kind of combines the focus on groups and communities with how individuals interact with their environment. So here we can say that there's a similarity to Goffman in the sense that Gary Allen Fine is looking at how our thoughts and our actions interact with structural forces, like we saw in our first book of the semester, Goffman's Stigma. So overall, I think there's a similarity between Goffman and Gary Allen Fine, where there's a social psychology of social organization going on in their sociological theories. Beginning to look at kitchens, today compared to the past, Fine talks about the presence of the idea of restaurants in popular culture. And in popular culture today, compared to the past, there's much more social recognition and a much higher status given to different restaurants, given to the chefs and kind of main cooks within restaurants. And the higher status and social recognition ties into our social medias today that concentrate on the restaurant industry, that concentrates on food, and then also different television programs and different channels solely dedicated to food and restaurants. And so overall, we can recognize how food and restaurants have become mainstream part of our popular culture, more so compared to the past, as a result of social media today and the focus on food and restaurants and television. And the good side of this is, these restaurants can receive more positive attention, and this positive attention can motivate more customers to visit the restaurants. The downside is that everybody becomes a critic, and so with our platforms, whether it be on a television show or whether it be on Yelp, the website, or simply just writing a review on a restaurant's Facebook page, everybody can become a critic, and sometimes the bad news, a bad review, can spread quickly and really do damage to the reputation, do damage to overall business of a restaurant. So we can see, the two sides of the coin that comes with kind of being part of popular culture today, more so compared to the past. Fine's interested in looking at restaurants as a social construct. And as a social construct, we're talking about how there's a lot of socially constructed elements going on that creates the restaurant that goes into a restaurant work. And so a lot of this, a lot of the kind of social constructed nature, a lot of the restaurant work goes on behind the scenes. It's what we call invisible work. People really don't think about it. People really don't see it. Thus, we don't fully understand or appreciate the work that goes on within the kitchen and the work that goes on within the restaurant to keep it functioning properly. So when looking at the main focus of Fine's research, we can say that although he's looking at different types of restaurants, different levels of restaurants, different locations of restaurants, the different focus of the restaurants, and their different target audiences, what he wants to do with these four different restaurants he observes is to concentrate on the similarities of the restaurant work that's going on rather than highlighting the differences of the places. Differences do exist, but he's focusing more on the similarities of the four restaurants he studies to kind of recognize restaurants as a social construct, to recognize all these socially constructed natures that go into producing a functional restaurant. In kitchens, Fine presents us a theory of social organization. So we can say that specifically he's looking at, or he's trying to explain, the what of his theory is the creation of social order in restaurants. So here we're looking at how he's explaining the interplay between the social and the personal when it comes to establishing functionality. So how can we create social order? How can we create a functional restaurant? This is what he's trying to look at through his research. And again, what's going on the personal level and what's going on the social level, and how those two things come together to produce social organization, to produce that order in a restaurant. And we can say that when looking at the personal and social that come together to establish functionality, we can say, yes, this does exist in restaurant work, finds focus in his theory, but his framework of social organization can be applied to other work forms and other organizations. So I say in the slide, you can think of sport teams that a lot of this apply to as well, in terms of what we'll read about and how those different pieces come together to create cohesion, to create functionality on a team, or perhaps in a military group, or perhaps in any other type of work that you've been in or that you can think of. So, a lot of us are familiar with restaurants and kitchens because we work there. So we get that firsthand direct experience. So this helps us kind of really understand what Fine's talking about because we can relate to a lot of his examples. But even though if you haven't worked in a restaurant, maybe indirectly you kind of understand what he's talking about because you've been and observed what's going on at restaurants as a customer. Even so, you can start to recognize what he's talking about because, again, a lot of these ideas can be applied outside of the restaurant world to other forms of work, to other organizations. At the beginning of his book, Fine gives the reader a little bit of a background, a little bit of a preview of what he's going to be doing on in the following chapters. So again, kind of looking at the interactions between the personal, what's going on the individual level, and what's going on in relation to the social, what's going on in terms of the social level, and how the two kind of play off one another to create social organization in the restaurant space. So, I can just touch on a couple things that will unpack a little bit more as we go through the book. But, he talks about some of the ways that the cooks actually get into the kitchen. So, so for a kitchen to be functional, for a restaurant to operate, you need to get people in the kitchen to do the cooking and provide customers the food. So he just kind of talks about two different paths, informally and formally, two different ways people end up a cook. So there's a formal way when people are kind of learning to be a cook, and you can learn to be a cook from another cook who may be a parent, somebody's father or mother, or perhaps a sibling. But also you can formally learn to cook from friends. So you kind of being taught formally kind of what to do and how to do it by a parent, by a friend. And a second formal way of becoming a cook is you attend some type of culinary school. You attend a cooking school to learn the trade of cooking. So you see that does happen, and that formal path is actually increasing today, and that kind of reflects the popularity of restaurant work, the popularity of becoming a cook, becoming a chef, and how with the higher recognition, the higher social status, more and more people want to become a cook. And when more and more people are trying to become a cook, trying to become a chef, then the competition increases. And when you see an increase in competition, you're going to see more and more people trying to go to schools, trying to formally learn from cooks, to grab the credentials, to get into the proper social networks that allow you to succeed within the field when there's a lot of people trying to do the same work that you're trying to do. So we can say that the formal means of becoming a cook are increasing, but still a lot of people end up in the kitchen, end up a cook informally. One way is you are working at a restaurant, perhaps as a runner, perhaps as a server, and just by chance, you end up cooking. So a cook quits, a cook moves on from her or his job, and they need a replacement quickly. So sometimes they'll turn to other workers, such as a server, such as a runner, to get into the kitchen and start to do some of the cooking. And then once you start to do some of it, it snowballs into you becoming kind of a permanent fixture as a cook in the kitchen. Sometimes you're not even working at a restaurant, but perhaps you're looking for work, and somebody again, kind of a friend or a family member, says, I know somebody who's looking for somebody to cook, or I know personally I'm looking for somebody that can help out in the kitchen. Would you like to help me out? Would you like for me to put in a word for you to them? And so again, just by kind of informal social connections, by chance, you end up as a cook. So that's how people get in, formally, informally. They get into the kitchen. And then Fine turns attention to how people get through. So by getting through, basically how you get through the day in the restaurant, how you try to manage different obstacles, how you try to manage different barriers that you encounter on a day-to-day basis. So again, these are different kind of personal social relations that we're going to unpack further as we go through the book. But one social personal connection we can look at is the social element, the social structure of time, and the personal element, the agency, the free will, trying to come up with different strategies to save time. So, different tricks of the trade, different strategies people learn to save time, thus minimizing waits for customers. So, if customers are waiting too long, if the kitchen is getting too backed up, then that's going to be bad for business. So, you need to come up with these different strategies to save time, such as kind of working ahead. When you have a slower period of the day, you anticipate the higher periods of the day by kind of doing what you need to do just to get ahead. Maybe you prepare for a weekend brunch late nights on the week days. So you just try to get ahead, and there's different strategies you can employ, different tricks of the trade you can use to save time and thus kind of manage that obstacle. Another kind of relation you can look at is the relationship of one's space, kind of the restaurant space itself, whether it be socially or physically, and how you try to keep up different appearances of that space. So basically, talking about a physical appearance of space, you try to employ strategies to make these spaces look clean for the customers. If you ever worked at a restaurant, you recognize that sometimes it's a lot of dirty work. Things can get messy quickly. And so the messiness, the dirtiness of restaurant work is something that could potentially turn the customer away, could turn the customer off. So you try to come up with these different strategies to maintain clean spaces, to keep up the appearance of a clean space, although often the restaurant can be more on the dirty side of things. And here sometimes you accomplish this goal, you manage this obstacle by keeping the back, the dirty space, and concentrating on the front of the restaurant where the customers are, what the customers can see, as the clean aspect. So there's a strategy you employ, kind of creating the backstage and the front stage, and making sure the front stage is clean, while the backstage, where the people are doing the cooking, that can be relatively dirty because people don't see those spaces. And finally, we can look at another social relation to the personal relation when looking at kind of people as a whole working at the restaurant and trying to create a coworker harmony. So the different strategies you can use to maintain coworker harmony, because again, if people are not working together, if there's infighting among coworkers, then that can be bad for business. So you try to come up with different strategies to promote and maintain coworker harmony, because you need that harmony for the business to function properly. The guidelines for Report 2 are the same guidelines that we used for the first book report. So we'll be breaking down the theory with respect to a summary, and then getting into the construction of reality, the elements of agency and structural forces, and the directional focus of the framework, top down or bottom up focus. And then again, we'll get into what we did before, the different comparisons to earlier theorists and theories. We'll get into how the ideas can be seen in our life today, how they relate to contemporary reality. And then we'll talk about perhaps what we could add or change about the theory. So overall, the guidelines are going to be the same. And think about the guidelines as you start to read through the book. And in our next couple presentations, I'll specifically try to unpack what's going on in the theory with respect to what I ask you to do in the paper. But just to kind of throw, one piece out there now, the action and the framework that we're going to be explaining in terms of, the action under examination for the construction of reality, the action being produced by structural forces and agency, the action being explained by a top-down or bottom-up focus. The action in the framework is going to be that creation of order, the creation of social order in restaurants. So keep that in mind, and then you can start to recognize what's that driving force behind creating social order, what's the elements of agency, what's the structural impact behind social order being created, and what's that focus, the top-down or bottom-up focus, when it comes to explaining how order is created. So we'll leave that there for now, and we'll continue to go through the book. We'll continue to look at the book in reference to the report guidelines with our next presentation.